Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to try to answer a simple question. Can an animal use photosynthesis in order to use the sun for its energy purposes? In other words, can an animal borrow some of the elements from a typical plant or from algae in order to survive? And the answer to this is sort of yes. But more specifically, we're going to be focusing on this recent experiment using frogs. The experiment with the video that you see right here, where the scientists injected algae into the brains of a developing frog and were able to revive the brain itself, which by itself is sort of amazing. But before we talk about this experiment, let's first talk about these tiny green organelles you see right here, known as chloroplasts. The tiny green organelles present in the cells of different plants and different algae that allow them to essentially use photosynthesis in order to do a lot of different things. First of all, obviously here the chlorophyll captures the energy from sunlight and then converts it into various energy storing molecules such as ATP, which then also releases oxygen from CO2, allowing various cells to use it for breathing. But at the same time, chlorophyll is also responsible for turning CO2 into more complex organic molecules. This is usually referred to as the Calvin cycle. But there are a lot of other functions it has in a typical plant as well. It synthesizes amino acids, various types of fatty acids, and it's even responsible for the immune system of a typical plant. But today, a lot of evolutionary biologists believe that just like the other organelle that we all have, mitochondrion, chlorophyll was probably its own bacterium long time ago and eventually got absorbed by various organisms, creating a kind of a symbiotic relationship with various algae and various plant cells that now live around the planet. It has its own DNA, it has its own way of dividing, and so by itself is an extremely intriguing organelle. So intriguing as a matter of fact that it would actually be extremely useful for a typical animal. For example, couldn't an animal somehow find a way to use chlorophyll for its own benefit, for its own use? I mean, technically, if we were to somehow absorb the chlorophyll and use it for our own purposes, we would never have to eat ever again. We could hypothetically receive all of the energy from just water and the sun, sort of like a typical plant. And so one of the more fascinating questions here would be, so okay, why is it that no animal seems to have any chlorophyll in it? Well, the answer to that is actually they do. Many animals have adapted to sort of steal chlorophyll from various algae and maybe even certain plants, and to then use it for their own purposes. One of the most famous animals doing so is this right here, a slug. Although not this particular slug. There's actually a species known as green sea slug, with the most famous one known as the sacoglossa slugs, that have adapted to absorb chlorophyll for their own purposes. And because of this, they even have a nickname, solar-powered sea slugs, with some of the members of the species basically looking like this. They do resemble a sort of a leaf-like formation, although their actual morphology is quite varied. There are quite a lot of different shapes and sizes. And just like a lot of slugs you usually find in the forest, initially a lot of sacoglossa slugs basically eat plants. They eat a lot of different types of kelp, they eat a lot of different types of algae, and as they do so, they tend to absorb some of the chloroplasts into their own cells. And although some of them do so for only a short period of time, maybe a week or two, at least one species is known to actually rely entirely on chloroplasts to survive after they've actually eaten enough. And these particular sea slugs, known as Elysia chlorotica, seem to be extremely similar to what you would actually find on a tree. They look extremely leaf-like. And this particular organism is extremely interesting because after a single major meal in their youth, they basically can go the rest of their life without ever eating again. And the scientists studying these slugs have always been fascinated by this organism. Mostly because once you catch a developed organism, you literally never have to feed it ever again. It does all of its activities, including mating, without ever needing to eat anything. But interestingly, slugs are not the only animals to have learned to do so. Scientists have discovered a lot of other simpler animals, including some of the flatworms that have been found in various oceans, that have also learned to essentially use chlorophyll for their own good. Today this phenomenon is referred to as Kleptoplasty, with the word klepto representing Greek for thief, because basically these animals learn how to steal something from plants and to then use it for their own benefit. But how exactly they're able to do so, and more importantly, how the chloroplasts are able to survive inside the animal cells, is still not really well understood. And at least theoretically, it should not really be possible. For example, we know that a typical chloroplast has very specific needs. The needs provided by a plant cell, something that was evolved for millions and millions of years. But while they're quite useful in producing oxygen and in producing complex organic molecules, they also produce a lot of toxic stuff as well that plant cells have learned to eliminate. But for animal cells, this could be potentially extremely dangerous. And that's of course just one of the mysteries of how these animals are able to use chloroplasts without basically getting poisoned by them. At the same time, nobody really knows how the chloroplasts survive inside these cells without, for example, being broken apart by the immune system or by something entirely different that's unique to animal cells. And so it's not entirely clear how these guys are able to do it. But there is one potential explanation to how all of this works. It's quite possible that a lot of these animals have actually learned to use chlorophyll as a kind of a storage unit. Basically, they use it to store various calories. And by using chlorophyll as a storage of energy, it both provides energy for chlorophyll to survive and also can be then used by the animal when it suddenly needs more extra energy. While at the same time, all of these extra calories allow the chlorophyll to function by itself and to then produce more oxygen and also various complex organic molecules and various types of sugars that could then be used by the animal for a lot of other functions. And so it's quite possible that a lot of these slugs have just adapted to use the chlorophyll as a kind of a unit of storage. And so the photosynthesis is just an extra benefit. The original purpose could have actually been kind of similar to our fat. It stores extra energy. And there's definitely a definitive correlation that was discovered in some of the papers between the total size and the amount of chlorophyll inside a typical sea slug and their overall effectiveness at then reproducing and producing offspring. With more chlorophyll, they were able to create more and bigger offspring. But it was not mandatory and they were still able to reproduce even without the presence of chlorophyll. And so because of these examples of kleptoplasty in nature, a lot of scientists have been also wondering if there's any way for us to use this for other purposes, maybe medicinal purposes, or maybe as a sort of a therapy. And so one of the recent experiments that was using an embryo from a frog decided to investigate this in more detail. Now the interesting thing about frogs is that they already have so many different techniques when it comes to absorbing oxygen. They don't just absorb oxygen through their lungs, they also do so through their gills and through their skin. So this animal has definitely developed a lot of techniques when it comes to trying to survive in low oxygen conditions. But the scientists wanted to take this a little bit further. They wanted to see if you could also maybe somehow use the oxygen from a typical chlorophyll to have the frogs breathe that way. So basically, could you maybe enforce a frog to have the so-called kleptoplasty? In this case, they were using frog embryos, or basically tadpoles, and were specifically using tadpoles that were starved of oxygen and were, well, basically not really alive anymore. At least clinically speaking, these tadpoles were kind of dead. Or at least brain dead. Now, watch what happens when the scientists inject these tadpoles with a species of a green algae right into their heart. And what's really interesting to see here is that the green algae starts to spread across the entire tadpole pretty fast. It's essentially going through the entire bloodstream, and it's also entering the tiny brain of the tadpole as well. So here, if we look at the before picture and the after picture, it becomes quite apparent that algae was distributed across pretty much most of the body of this tadpole. And to the scientists' surprise, this actually revived the brain cells of this particular tadpole. The brain cells started to operate as they normally would. And remember, these cells were originally oxygen starved. And so what the algae is doing here is introducing oxygen into those brain cells, providing the oxygen they needed in order to function properly. And apparently this provided more than enough oxygen for all of the cells to come back to life. Although naturally this only happened when the light was on. Without the light, the photosynthesis would stop, and unfortunately the cells would no longer receive any oxygen. And so in some sense, one of the reasons this worked is because these tadpoles are basically transparent, they allow the light through. So obviously this would not be possible in all of the animals. But nevertheless, this is a really exciting technique. One of the more surprising discoveries here is how quickly all of this happened. Within only 15 minutes, the cells returned back to their normal activity, with the scientists even claiming that the cells were performing much better than originally, suggesting that the oxygenation in this case made them even slightly stronger. But I guess the question is this in any way useful? Well, the scientists behind this paper suggest that this could be maybe used in certain therapies where we need to oxygenate an organ very quickly. For example, if there is a sudden shortage of oxygen in the brain, or if there is a sudden shortage of oxygen in a vital part of the body where the oxygen has to be delivered quickly. So there is a possibility for using this therapy sometime in the future, but at the moment there are still a lot of difficulties. The biggest difficulty is, of course, our immune system. It's most likely going to completely destroy all of the cells, and with algae possibly even causing some sort of allergic or toxic reaction that could end up being more dangerous than the original condition. And so even though there is a possibility to use this in therapy, at least for now the success is uniquely for species like these tadpoles, transparent and without complex bodies. But all of this research is still in its infancy, so I'm sure a lot more discoveries are going to be made in the future in regards to this Kleptoplasty, the use of chlorophyll in various animal species. Definitely a really fascinating concept. Anyway, on that note, check out the relevant links in the description below. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining a channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.